If you've traveled outside the United States over the past 40 years, you've undoubtedly boarded the plane clutching a Lonely Planet guidebook. Tony Wheeler joined the Asian hippie trail in the 1970s, and a year later, with his wife Maureen, founded Lonely Planet, which is today the largest guidebook company in the world, publishing over 500 titles in 8 languages. Tony Wheeler has been traveling his whole life. Born in England, he lived in Pakistan till age 5, went to high school in the US, and attended university back in the UK. In 2005, he sold Lonely Planet to the BBC and established the Planet Wheeler Foundation, which we'll talk a little bit about today. He still writes for Lonely Planet. His most recent 2 books are Badlands, A Tourist on the Axis of Evil, and Tony Wheeler's Darklands. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Tony Wheeler to the JCCSF. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
So for those who don't know and who weren't around then, what is the Asian hippie trail?
It was the early 70s, and the baby boomers were coming of age, and they were going further than their parents had gone. And it was also the swinging 60s that had its effect, and the Beatles had gone off in search of sitar music and meditation to India, and people were riding the Marrakesh Express. It was a cultural thing, and there was just this idea of you would follow the trail out to India and find something when you got to India, and we did that. We set off. We bought an old car in London, and the idea of this car was it was so cheap that if it broke down, we'd just leave it by the roadside and walk away from it. And we drove it as far as Afghanistan. And we got to Afghanistan and we sold it for a $5 profit. And I've been saying for the last 20 years that it was probably Osama bin Laden's getaway vehicle, that if they could just track that car down, they could have saved making that silly movie. But yeah, we ended up in Afghanistan, and we carried on, and eventually we ended up in Australia and thought someone should write a book about this, and that was Lonely Planet.
So who were your fellow travelers on the so-called
They were
hippie trail?
people very similar to us, and I think the first Lonely Planet guides were written for us. They were written for people who were in their early 20s and who had no money. So you had time. You know, I think at that point there was this feeling, you know, you could always get another job. You'd drop out and you could drop back in 12 months' time. And we just wanted to travel as far as the little money would take us.
And that was very different than the books that many of us remember from the 60s, early 70s, Europe on $5 a day. The whole tone was different. Everything about it was different. How would you describe the difference?
Well, there was, and yet, you know, I've met Arthur Fromer a couple of times, and the guy who started Europe on $5 a day, and I've got huge respect for what he did, because prior to that, I remember I know of quite a few other guidebook publishers, and we talk about these things, and I remember the guy from who started Rough Guide saying that when they did their first book, which was a guide to Greece, he said you could go to Greece and you could find these books that went on and on about every temple and ruin and anything else of ancient Greece you wanted to see, but somehow the word beach never got mentioned. And, you know, what did people did go there for the ruins and so on, but they also went there for the beaches. And that was the thing about what we were doing, is that the people were there they wanted more than just to find on one side the ruins and the temples and the palaces, and on the other side the hotels. They wanted to understand something about the culture. They wanted to get in beneath the skin of the country a bit. They weren't just there on a 2-week vacation. They might be staying for 6 months. Mm-hmm. So it was a different perspective.
So the culture, the political history, and so forth. I heard, and tell me if this is true, that the name Lonely Planet came from what I understand is called a mondegreen, a misunderstood rock song phrase.
It did, yeah. We put together our first book, and from the start we published it ourselves. We didn't take it to another publisher. And Maureen and I, everything was there. It had a title. It was called Across Asia on the Cheap. The only thing we didn't have was a name for the business. And we were sitting around, we'd had a little bit too much red wine, trying to dream up a name. And we'd just been to see the classic rock and roll band on the road film called Mad Dogs and Englishmen. And it was Joe Cocker and Leon Russell doing a road tour around the United States. And one of the songs in that was a song called Space Captain. And Joe Cocker sings, Once while traveling across the sky, this lonely planet caught my eye. And I was sort of humming that. And I said to Maureen, that sounds good. Why don't we call it Lonely Planet? And she said, great idea, except he sings Lovely Planet. So it's been a 40-year mistake.
And it worked.
But it worked, yeah.
So I mentioned that your next to most recent book, Badlands, was inspired, the countries you chose, by George Bush's Axis of Evil Countries. Tony, most people were not inspired to visit those places. Why?
Well, I've got a little slideshow, which I did this morning over at the Lonely Planet office in Oakland. And I did it a couple of weeks ago in China. And it starts with a picture of George Bush in the cover of the book. And I say, George Bush made me write it. Unfortunately, in China, they misinterpreted this. And the report said George Bush asked him to write it, which was not the story at all. Well, as soon as he said there are 3 countries that are so bad they constitute an axis of evil, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, I thought, well, I want to go there. You know? I'd been to Iran already a couple times, but I hadn't been to Iraq, and the war was going on, but I did go to Iraq. And I went to North Korea, which to this day is still the weirdest place I've ever been to.
So North Korea, let's start there then. You, at the end of Badlands, have an evil meter. And North Korea rates highest on the evil meter. Why?
Well, I said there's 3 things. We can get 10 points if you're perfectly evil. And the first thing is, how bad are you to your own people? You know, if you starve your own people or put them in prison because they say, how about democracy? Or, you know, if you're rotten to your own people, well, that could score you 3 points. And North Korea's pretty good at that. They've starved lots of people to death, but they get it pretty close to a perfect score. If you're threatening other countries, you're going to declare war on them, you're going to invade them, well, that could get you some points. Or if you're fomenting terrorism. Well, North Korea's done all of that stuff. You see, Iraq, I said, Iraq never fomented any terrorism. They didn't like you. They'd launched the mother of all wars. But they weren't going to didn't bother with terrorism. So they didn't score so well on that one. Then the third thing, you got 3 points for each. And then if you had a really good personality cult, and again, the North Koreans won. You know, Kim Il-sung put up bigger statues to himself. He had more billboards. Gaddafi was pretty keen on billboards as well. But I'm afraid when it came to evil, North Korea was top of the scale.
Well, I was laughing and crying when I was reading about North Korea, as one does. But you talk about how everywhere you went, you were told about miracles that occurred because Kim Il-sung visited that particular place,
Yeah.
even the weather.
Everything. Yeah, he would turn up and he would teach the farmers how to farm better, and he would teach fishermen how to catch more fish. And there's a wonderful book. It's Kim Il-sung was the great leader, and then Kim Jong-il was the dear leader, and now we're on to Kim Jong-un. Or the Chinese. And in China, if you say anything the government's critical of, it gets cut out. But in China, you can say anything about North Korea at all you like on social media. And they call the new one Fatty 3, because it's been Fatty 1, Fatty 2, and they're on to Fatty 3. So on social media in China, that's, what they're talking about. But there's a wonderful book put out called Kim Jong-il, the second one, Looking at Things. And all it is pictures of him looking at beer bottles coming off the brewery line, or him looking at something being made, or him looking at the army training. And every picture is of him looking at it, and then 2 people looking at him.
Is Disneyland in the book?
Oh, it would be.
And what's with the Dennis Rodman thing?
Oh, I don't know. It's strange. Look, it's a place that attracts strange people.
I guess so. Another country, you mentioned Iran, and you had been there before, but actually, and somewhat surprisingly probably to most of us, you found a lot that you really liked about Iran. Tell us about it.
It's a strange place, Iran, and I meet a lot of people who've gone there, and inevitably there'll be, I'm sure there's somebody here who's been to Iran, and they'll look around and they've had a good experience there, because they are outgoing, friendly people, and they're very proud of that. So many times I was told, this is not Pakistan. We don't have the, we're much more literate than Pakistan. Or alternatively, this is not Saudi Arabia. Women are not locked up and locked away. And I remember the last time I went there, I get off the plane and I'm thinking, I haven't got a hotel booked, and I'm trying to get a hotel, and there's, I'm within 5 minutes, I'm talking to a woman at a tourist desk. Sure wouldn't happen in Saudi Arabia. So they're different in that respect. And, there are people who love poetry. People who sit around and, drink tea and quote poetry to each other. And, there are places where great poets died and there are memorials to them. And every time you walk through a park, there's people sitting around drinking tea, having a picnic, and they see a foreigner, because there aren't so many foreigners there. Hello, we speak English over here. Come and talk to us. I never went to a restaurant. I was by myself, and I've been there with Maureen, my wife, as well. But the last trip I was by myself, and I was never in a restaurant without another table saying, you're by yourself, come over, we speak English at this table, come over and join us. Very outgoing people, and yet this crazy government. Things don't
So where
match.
did Iran score on the evil meter?
Well, it definitely gets some evil, yeah. No question.
But not quite the
lots,
North Korea.
But not quite up to the North Korean standards.
So Pakistan, you were born in Pakistan.
I didn't. My brother and sister were born, but I went there when I was 1 year old.
Okay. Well, a lot of people who are intrepid travelers wouldn't necessarily go to Pakistan because they feel it's really dangerous there. And you say that the architectural ruins are amazing. There's a rich Buddhist history, and it's a land of many contradictions.
It is indeed. I was in Pakistan when I was 1 year old until I was 5. So I'm that's an age where you have some very crystal clear memories, and I've got some very sharply drawn memories of those early years in Pakistan. And my younger brother and younger sister were both born in Karachi in Pakistan. And then I've returned a number of times over the years. On one occasion, my wife and I were there after the big earthquake, which was, 6 or 7 years ago, with an aid group who were doing work there. And we were in the earthquake zone, which had really been closed off to outsiders for quite a long time, because it's close to the border with India. And then we were there just over a year ago, in fact, almost exactly a year ago, when we traveled up through northern Pakistan up to China. And it's a country that's got a lot of the things that India has, the Mughal history and that architecture and an Islamic history. Buddhism, of course, passed through there. A lot of Buddhist reminders in the north. And the mountains are just as beautiful as they are in the Himalaya or in Nepal or in India. And yet, for very good reasons, there are hardly any tourists there at all. And we would stay sometimes in some beautiful... I remember there was one hotel we stayed up in the mountains that was an old fortress that turned into a small boutique hotel. And it was just beautiful. And there was a little garden out down to the river, and you could sit having breakfast out as this beautiful river rushed by. And the rooms were wonderful, and it was so nicely done. And, of course, there was nobody else staying there at all.
What about the drones?
And the drones were flying over, a little bit over to one side.
There is that.
Yeah, I you could get bombed by Barack Obama there. It's not a good look.
No. Well, so here's the thing. Everybody's wondering, Pakistan, it's beautiful. You're in this idyllic place. What about the danger element?
Well, and I was saying afterwards, I traveled through and I had no problems at all. And when I crossed into Pakistan, I walked across the border from India into Pakistan, and then took a bus to Islamabad. And Maureen, my wife, who was in Paris, flew into Islamabad from Paris. So we arrived in opposite directions. And I met a young German guy crossing the border, and he was the only other person crossing the border at that time. And I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm just coming back. I've been in Pakistan for 3 months. And I've gone into India to renew my visa, and I've come back for another 3 months. So I'm spending 6 months in Pakistan. And I said, God, you must really love the place. He said, yeah, I just find it a great place to travel around. And I said, and you're not worried at all? He said, no, I've had no problems whatsoever. And I said, and you seen many tourists? And he said, yes, 13 in 3 months. So it's not exactly, overrun by tourists. We actually saw more than 13, but not too many more. But, it's... And then a year later, there was that group of mountaineers who were all killed. And they were there, and why were they killed? Because they were angry with America. And what nationality were they? Chinese, Ukrainian? No, one was Chinese-American, but that was as close as they got. It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
Completely ridiculous.
Yeah. I want to turn for a moment to Africa, Zimbabwe in particular. And you said that badly governed countries have a lot of things in common. They often have rigged elections, corruption, of course, but the money problem tops the list, currency, and Zimbabwe in particular is an illustration of this.
Zimbabwe is the perfect illustration of it, and I carry the illustration around with me. I remember I once met Larry Page from Google, and during the dinner conversation, he said, I always like to have a big note with me, so if I run out of cash, and he pulled out of his wallet a €1,000 note. And I always wonder, the only reason countries have big denomination notes is for corrupt reasons, isn't it? So you can pay people off. And €1,000 is about $1,500. So you've got one note of that size. Well, I can do better than that. I carry around with me the $100 trillion note. The Zimbabwean $100 trillion note.
What's it worth?
Well, it was worth about $30 when it came out. And within about 2 weeks, it was down to 30 cents. And very soon it was down to 3 cents, and then to a third of a cent. And that was the end of the Zimbabwe dollar. It was just hopeless. They could not stop the inflation.
So it's US dollars?
So now they use US dollars. You go to an ATM machine and put your card in, and US dollars come out.
Wow.
Yeah. And that works.
And as in the rest of Africa, is there a lot of Chinese investment in Zimbabwe?
The Chinese are in everywhere you go in Africa these days. The Chinese are there. They're building the roads, restoring the railways, and taking out the minerals. Yeah, everywhere. In China and Zimbabwe as much as anywhere else.
2 more countries, and then we'll move on. Cuba, you've made several trips to Cuba, I believe.
No, I haven't actually. I went to Cuba for the Badlands book, because, here's a country which is, Fidel is pretty soon going to outlast his 12th or 13th American president if he survives another year or two. And they've all been saying, how about some regime change here? And it's never happened. And yet I was, ambivalent about Cuba, because a lot of that, they can blame some of it on the American embargo, but you can still get Coca-Cola there. It comes in via Mexico. You can still fly there. Don't try booking with an American website, but you can fly with Virgin from London straight to Havana, or you can fly from Cancun straight to Havana. It's no problem to get there, or from Toronto. It's you can do all these things, but a lot of the problems are not created by the American embargo. They're created by Fidel and his crazy views of how things should work.
So on the ground, where was your ambivalence? What was it that you saw or experienced that...
The fact that people just were not allowed to do anything for themselves, and the fact that, doctors are getting less money than anybody who can somehow get in touch with foreigners and get legitimately get money from them because they're being paid in dollars, which is worth a lot of money. And then things like my wife and I, we traveled around, we rented a car, and we picked up hitchhikers everywhere.
Yeah.
Because there's not enough transport. So everywhere you go, there's hitchhikers, and you pick them up, and you have a couple of lawyers in the back seat, or a grandmother in the front with you, or you picked up all sorts of interesting people.
Yeah.
But we stayed in lots of little hotels, and locally run ones as well, because you're allowed to run a place locally if it's not too big. As soon as you need employees to run it, then that's too bad. You can't do it. You can have the Spanish running huge hotels with lots of employees, but you can't have Cubans doing it. Well, this is absurd.
Yeah.
Totally absurd.
So this brings us to Israel and Palestine.
And I went
here
there
we
as
are
well.
at the JCC, and even those names are disputed. There are people who would not say Palestine. We have the Gaza or the West Bank or the occupied territories or many names.
And both sides, yeah.
Both sides. So give us a snapshot of your travels there.
Well, I was... when I'd been there for a little while, I was traveling one day. I spent 2 days with a journalist from Haaretz, and I probably mispronounced then, did I?
Haaretz, and actually we have a series coming up with some of those journalists, so I'm glad you mentioned it.
And I'd met him before, and we were spending a couple of days walking on the Israeli National Trail down in the Negev. Fantastic walking.
For those who don't know, Haaretz is the leading Israeli progressive newspaper. Sorry, go ahead.
And he said to me, what's the weirdest country? Fortunately, he didn't ask me what's my favorite country. That's a question I hate to be asked. But he did ask me what's the weirdest country, and I said North Korea, as I will always say. And then he said, okay, what's the second weirdest? And I said Saudi Arabia. And I think to me, there's no question about that. This is, an American #1 friend, and yet it's totally against any form of democracy. It's a place where women are not allowed to drive, not allowed to show their faces, you're not allowed to go to a cinema, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. They chop off hands. They provided most of the terrorists for 9/11. You know, it's a bizarre, and yet I had a wonderful time traveling around there. And we subsequently, Lonely Planet, a woman updated the Lonely Planet Saudi Arabia code. I was so amazed she managed to do that, but she did. So, you know, it's possible to do these things. But Saudi Arabia is a totally weird country. And he said, okay, number 3. And I said, well, here we are. This is a pretty weird place we're in right now. Because what is it? What's the name of it? You know, and is it 2 countries or 1 country? And, you know, nobody can agree and nobody knows what's going to happen longer term.
Seems pretty intractable at this point.
It is intractable. And I traveled around both sides, Israel and Palestine. I traveled with, I decided I'd do some walking. But, you know, if you walk, you do things more slowly, you see the world at a different pace. And you're walking with other people and talking with them. And I walked with an Israeli friend of mine and his son and the Haaretz journalist and another person for another day, for 4 days in the Negev. And I also walked up in the Galilee region with 3 Israeli friends. And I walked in Palestine for a day with a guy from a refugee camp, Palestinian. So I did get these different sort of views on it. And nobody could see any answers. Mm-hmm. You know, everybody said to me, things are going to have to get worse before they eventually get better, which is not very encouraging.
Not at all.
No.
Well, moving on to something completely different, I understand that you recently took a Cunard ship across the Atlantic. It was recent when I read about it. So you like a little bit of the upscale, a little bit of the high life as well.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, on my bucket list there were many things, and one of them is the idea of going out across the Atlantic and, you know, going. Really, you should come into New York and come by the Statue of Liberty that way. But Maureen and I just happened to be going to New York, and then we looked at what day we were leaving it, and we were going to fly to London. And then we looked at the Cunard schedule, and the Queen Mary was sailing out that day. You know, it was so perfectly timed. You thought, well, we better do that. So we went on the Queen Mary and had a suite, you know, so it was very luxurious. And having done it, I never need to do it again. I've decided that is my cruise ship experience. And they said this is not a cruise ship, this is an ocean liner. Cruise ships just go around in circles. We go from one place to another place. But nevertheless, to me, it was a cruise ship. And I have now done cruise ships for this lifetime.
Did you take full advantage? Did you do everything there was to do? Eat every meal, go to every nightclub, the whole...
We did it all, yeah. But really, I just didn't get it. It wasn't...
You wanted to be traipsing through some third
after
world
a few days, it was sort of get up, been there, done this. I do something else.
So you and
we've done a few. Every year there's some really good trip. This year, Maureen and I Maureen and I travel together quite a lot, and we also travel separately quite a lot. I do a fair amount of travel by myself, and half of the countries in Darklands I did by myself, and some of them I did with Maureen. But we do at least one longish trip every year, and there's sometimes this year we did the Trans-Siberian train trip. So we traveled from Beijing, so it's the Trans-Mongolian, but you know most of it's across Siberia. So that's a couple of weeks with a train, and that was terrific. That was really good. And then we did that Karakoram highway trip up through Pakistan, and then we did the Queen Mary, all in the last 2.5 years. And really, of the 3, the Pakistan trip was the best. Trans-Siberian second, the Queen Mary third.
Why?
It just wasn't exciting. It was just, you know, it was comfortable and the food was good, but that was it.
Nothing. You also did something a bit more unusual, which was you went to the space launch.
Oh, yeah.
In
and
Russia.
That was fun.
Kazakhstan.
That's where I met Larry Page. I also met Sergey Brin.
Ah.
In fact, Eric Anderson, who runs Space Adventures, and if you want to go up to space and back down again, Richard Branson will soon take your 100,000 or whatever it's going to cost and do that. But Eric Anderson will take your, I think it's 20 million or something, and that's only the start, because as well as paying 20 million, you get 2 weeks up there, though. It's not just 5 minutes. You get 2 weeks on the International Space Station. But apart from the $20 million for 2 weeks, you've also got to learn to speak Russian, and you have to spend 6 months at the Cosmonaut Training Center in Moscow. And actually, what I really liked about this is Eric Anderson, the guy who put this together, years ago, somebody came to him, the son of an astronaut, said, you know, Dad was an astronaut, and actually it was he was the guy, Richard Garriott, who I saw go up. And Richard Garriott said, Dad was an astronaut, went up there with NASA twice. I would like to go up, and I'm very rich from the computer games I've invented. I could afford to go up there. Why can't we talk NASA into taking us up? So they went to NASA and they said, look, you've got 7 seats in this thing. We'll sign the disclaimer, it's our own risk, and we'll pay for our seat. You ask what it is and we'll pay. And NASA said to them, we don't take up computer game entrepreneurs, we take up heroes. So NASA just said no.
Wow.
So they went to the Russians and said to the Russians, we've been turned down by NASA, will you take us up? We'll pay heaps of money. And the Russians said, God, nobody's ever asked us that. We have to go away and think about it. There are safety questions. And also, because the International Space Station is owned by NASA, by the European Space Commission, by the Russians, and by somebody else, maybe the Japanese, I think it is. Anyway, we had to get their permission as well. Pay us $100,000 and we'll think about it. So they wrote them out a check for $100,000 and they said, come back in 6 months. And in 6 months they came back and they said, right, $20 million, learn Russian, 6 months training, and you're on.
Wow.
And 8 people have paid it and done it. But anyway, Eric Anderson said, why don't you come and see a launch? So I said, yeah, that'd be fun. I'm not going to spend $20 million if I had it. So I went to Moscow and spent a day at the Cosmonaut Training Center. And Sergey Brin and Larry Page also turned up, and Schmidt. So we had the whole triumvirate of Google were there, and a lot of other very, very interesting people. The guy who founded the X, what's it called? Not the X, the X...
Xbox?
X Prize, the X Prize.
Oh, okay.
Yes, he was there.
Okay.
The guy who, well, he did put the first prize up for a suborbital flight. And a bunch of other really interesting and strange people. And we all spent a day at the Cosmonaut Training Center, and then we flew in this shaky old Tupolev chartered plane. I thought, this plane went down, you're taking all of Google out, and Lonely Planet. We flew down to Baikonur, we met the Russian cosmonaut, the NASA astronaut, and the guy, Richard Garriott, who was paying the money to go up. We saw the thing fueled. We watched the launch. It was all terrific. And it was just a weird week. And one of the great moments was we're sitting there ready for the launch. And I had to, after the launch, we flew back to Moscow, and I was really on a tight schedule. I had to go to meet some people in Indonesia. And I'd said, I really don't want to come all the way there and then find I have to leave early because the launch has been put off for a day. And they said to me, on Wednesday at 3 p.m. it launches. At 3 p.m. on Wednesday it will launch. And it did. So at 2:45 we're standing out there, and we're standing like a couple of 100 meters away from it, just in the desert. And these NASA guys were there, and they said if this was Cape Canaveral, we would be 4 miles away in a bunker. And we're standing there, and you could just see the thing. It's no distance away at all. And someone comes over to us and says, if you want to get closer, you can climb over that barbed wire fence. And a couple of us did. And when it went off, you were showered with dust, and your fingers in your ears, and the heat. It was phenomenal. I loved it.
That is a great adventure.
It was a great adventure. I didn't even go up on the Great. I just sat there and watched somebody else go up on the Great Adventure.
I can't imagine what could top that.
It was hard to top. It was great.
Wow. So from the sublime to the more mundane, and I'm almost embarrassed to ask this, but I want to know. So all of us, each nationality has its own sort of stereotypical bad travel habit. Americans are perceived one way in the world. French are perceived one way. Germans another way. Give us a couple of your observations about those things that you've seen. I'm asking you to be snarky, okay?
Yeah, we do. I mean, the German thing is that the Germans want the sun loungers around the pool. And they go out and grab them at dawn. And you do see it. It's one more territorial demand. Czechoslovakia wasn't enough. And you do that. I've been to places where there are signs on the thing saying, you cannot reserve this sun lounger unless you are your body is in it. You can't go out at dawn and put your, sunscreen and your towel on it, and it's now yours when you come out there at 11 o'clock. That's the German bad habit. Look, Australians drink too much. There's so many places where the unconscious Australians are there having consumed far too much alcohol. The Chinese currently are, going around and making themselves... And the funny thing is, the Chinese, because everything happens faster in China, they're almost immediately realizing what they're doing wrong and all ticking each other off and saying, we mustn't always fight to the front of the queue. And there was a wonderful story in the New Yorker a year or so ago. You've read it.
Yeah.
An American journalist who lived in China and spoke fluent Mandarin. And he thought what he would do is he would go on a tour of Europe with a Chinese group. So he signed up for this, and you didn't even know where he was going to. The day before the trip, wherever they could get cheap seats on the plane, and it didn't matter where they went, so we're going to go all around Europe in the end anyway. So whether they've started in Munich or Amsterdam or Rome or Paris, what the hell? So he got on this, and it was wonderful. All it was an interesting story.
A lot of cultural observations.
Full of wonderful observations, and and these Chinese people sort of coming out and telling him what they thought, and full of things. But at the start, the guide saying, you're just going to have to put up with the fact that Europeans are slow. They can't do things, if you go into a shop in China, you expect the person running the shop to be giving that person change, taking an order from that person, picking it up the shelf for that person, doing all three things simultaneously. He said Europeans just can't. They just serve one person at a time. One person gets served and then the next person. You can't expect these slow Europeans to do things the way efficiently we do in China. And it was full of nice little observations like that. It was a great story. But every nationality has their own little tray that they upset people about.
We Americans often see ourselves in the mirror when we travel, and it's not always pretty.
Yeah, but we all have something that's not pretty about, and we will make, we put up with these things.
We do. So obviously you started the business with books, and here we are in the internet age. How has the role of guidebooks changed now? Are people still carrying them around the way they used to? Are they downloading them on their handheld devices?
They're doing all sorts of things. There isn't any one specific thing they do, and I'm just after I leave San Francisco, I'm going on to China for a week and then on to Indonesia. And I don't want to carry around the China book with me. I'm traveling light, and so I've got it on I've got the China book with me, the Lonely Planet China book, on my iPad. It's just a more efficient way of doing it.
Yeah. Well, I mean...
But on the other hand, books are nice sometimes. And when I did the Trans-Siberian book, it was nicer having the book. You didn't have to turn it on and off and find your page. You could have page markers on it. And, in that respect, and I wasn't worried about weight because I was on a train and it just sat in my compartment.
Well, speaking of traveling light, I'm sure you're asked all the time, so I'll just ask it for everybody else. The packing tips.
Well, my number one packing tip is this is not like going to the office. If you have just the blue shirt and... Which one have I got? The grey shirt today. The blue shirt and the red shirt. And if in the office, you wore the blue shirt on Monday, the red shirt on Tuesday, the blue shirt again on Wednesday, the red shirt on Thursday, people are going to think, what the hell's up with... Don't you have anything else to wear? You're the only person who's traveling with you is your partner or whatever. Everybody else are people you're meeting every day. You're wearing one, the other is washed, drip drying in the shower. So when you really, I don't cut it down as close as just 2 shirts, but really that's all you need. You don't need the variety of things that you need at home. And the greater pleasure of not having to cart bags around and wait for them to come off the carousel and haul them from place to place, versus the pleasure of having something different to wear all the time. And anything you need, if you really do need a third shirt, you can always buy one, and it'll probably be an interesting buy that you can. And I always think that hotel, laundry things, they set the prices of what it costs to wash a shirt on what it would cost you to buy a new shirt in the shop next door. So if it says $9 to wash your shirt, shirts are available in this town for $8.
So pack less.
So pack less, yeah. Or the other thing is to pack your bag, and when it's packed, open it up again and take half of the stuff out and then put twice as much money in your wallet. That will work well as well.
So before we move on to audience questions, and I know there'll be many, I want to ask you about the work of Planet Wheeler, your foundation, and tell us about that.
Well, we had a foundation at Lonely Planet for a long time, and this started back in the 80s, and it was the famine in Ethiopia that kicked it off, and it kicked off a lot of people's thoughts about things not working in Africa, and so we started a Lonely Planet Foundation, and we did it in different ways over the years, but at the end we were putting 5% of our pre-tax profits into it, so it came out to be a reasonable amount of money at the end. But after we sold Lonely Planet, it couldn't carry on with the new owners. So we pulled it out of Lonely Planet, although it actually still operates in the Lonely Planet office. We renamed it Planet Wheeler, and quite a lot of the money that we got from selling Lonely Planet, we put into that. And my daughter helps to run it. And it's mainly projects in health, particularly infant health, and education, and most of them are in Southeast Asia and in East Africa, two regions we have a particular interest in. We've got about 70 projects that we're currently working on, and very often, if I'm in I don't have, finally approve projects we do, but I'm not involved in checking them out and assessing them. My daughter does a lot of that. She does a lot of travel for it. But if I'm in a country where we're doing things, I'll go and see the projects. And I remember last year, I was in Cambodia, and there's a children's hospital that we've really helped build. We built it, in fact. We put all the money up to build this hospital, about 30 kilometers out of Siem Reap, where Angkor Wat is. So I went out to have a look at it, and I looked around the hospital, and they were telling me, they said, we've got a very simple policy with medical health here in Cambodia. There's village medical centers, and if you go there with some problem, and they can do it, it's free. If they have to send you to a bigger hospital, you're charged $1. If you decide you're going to jump over that and go straight to the bigger hospital, they'll charge you $2. So there's an incentive to go to the local one. He said, why don't you go and look at one? They said there's a local one only about 5 miles from here. There's a doctor here. He's got a motorcycle. He'll take you out and have a look at it. So I jumped on the back of his motorcycle, and we went there. And the woman who ran this little centre wasn't around. And there was somebody else at the front. And we said, where is she? And she said, oh, she's just in the back room there delivering a baby. It wasn't a problem, so it's a $1 baby. We're not, you didn't have to go to the hospital and pay $2 for a baby. It was $1. And a couple of minutes later, she came out sort of washing her hands, rolling up her sleeves, and she said, saw me and said, do you want to come in and see the baby? So I was there with this woman, this baby that was born 5 minutes ago. And that was delightful. That was terrific. And that's really nice to see that sort of thing.
Yeah. And you're also, I believe, still involved with the Global Heritage Fund? Or?
Yeah, which is, I'm going to a couple of things for them tomorrow and the next day in Palo Alto. They're Palo Alto based, and it's Global Heritage is archaeology, but looking at projects in the developing world, which are the sort of second level projects. Everybody knows about Machu Picchu in Peru, but what about the other ones in Peru? Or everybody knows about Angkor Wat in Cambodia. So they're looking at projects that need the archaeological protection and investigation and so on, but also, if they were developed, would start attracting more tourists, and that would bring money into the local economy, and guest houses and restaurants and cafes and guides. These employment would be created. And I've joined, I'm not an archaeologist, but I do know something about tourism. So I'm on their board as that sort of tourism perspective on it.
You know more than a little bit about tourism. So now it's your turn. Questions for Tony Wheeler, just put your hand up and Brian will get to you.
Good afternoon. Burma is
Yes.
a country that's gone through some transitions since 2011. I was wondering if you could give us any insights into how it was previously, if you'd been there, and if you happen to have been there post-2011, what you've seen.
Yeah, Burma, boy, there's a place that's caused me some trouble over the years. I went to Burma the first time in 1974, so a long time ago. And at that time, it was so much unlike the rest. I mean, all of Southeast Asia has developed an amazing amount in those years, but Burma was way behind at that time and has stayed way behind even to today. And it was fascinating to see because it was so cut off and so isolated and so untouched. But then, things all started to turn around and it became very politically incorrect to go to Burma. And we at Lonely Planet got a lot of criticism for our Burma guide. And a lot of people said, look, by doing a guidebook, you're encouraging people to go there. And by going there, they're putting money in the pockets of the military government. And Aung San Suu Kyi is under house arrest. And therefore, you should withdraw your book and take it off the market. And the trouble was, we knew lots of Burmese people. We had lots of Burmese friends. And we knew that they had little businesses. It was what kept their families going. And even though it wasn't the sort of tourism you got in Thailand or other countries in that region, it still was an important thing to them. And we didn't feel that we should withdraw the book. And as a result, we got a lot of criticism for it. Now, of course, it's all turned around again, and it's perfectly okay to go to Burma, and it's becoming so popular that it's hard to find a hotel room. And although I went there. Last time I was there was about 3 years ago, so you could tell the change was coming. There was really a feeling of transition, and it's a fabulous place to visit. It's one of my favorite countries. It's got a lot to be said for it, and very interesting people, and sadly a bad history for many years.
Next.
Hi. I was just curious about the BBC acquisition and what might have gone through. What was the process of doing that and selling your baby and all that?
The BBC acquisition. When Maureen and I, we were getting older. Our kids, although both of them worked in the business for a while, neither of them were going to take it over, and it wasn't going to be a family dynasty that went on, from one generation to another. And also, I love the guidebooks, and although I'm as much as I'm on the web as much as anybody else, and I do I've got a little blog website, and I put stuff up on that all the time. Although I do all these things, it wasn't my first love the way the guidebooks were. And really, if you're doing anything, it's got to be something you are absolutely passionate about. And the way things were changing, it was changing in ways that I wasn't absolutely passionate about. So we decided it was time to get out, and we had quite a few people who were interested in it and talked to us about it. But the BBC at the end just seemed like the perfect partners. They had all sorts of good ideas. Unfortunately, the good ideas didn't work out. Part of it was we didn't sell to BBC, we sold to BBC Worldwide, and BBC Worldwide is the commercial arm of the BBC. The arm that makes money and puts the money back into the totally taxpayer-free element of the BBC. And suddenly they started to get criticism. The government or people saying, hey, they've gone too far. When we said make money, we didn't mean make this much money. And one of the things they said was and we didn't mean buy things like Lonely Planet. And the fact that all this criticism came up just when they bought Lonely Planet, instead of sort of jumping in and putting their foot on the accelerator and driving faster than ever, they sort of slowed down and pulled into the inside lane and moved more slowly. So a lot of the things that we thought were going to happen. And if I give one example, we had a television division at Lonely Planet. I mean, I did a program on Alaska and a program on Laos with Lonely Planet TV. If you'd said one thing that should have gone off like a rocket with the BBC, you'd have said television. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we did more television at Lonely Planet in the 5 years prior to the BBC than the 5 years after the BBC. So it was a story that just didn't work out the way we thought it would. And well, it was not my concern anymore because I'd sold it. But nevertheless, I'm sorry about the way things didn't work out. Because in many ways, they were perfect partners.
Okay, next question over here.
I assume you're a citizen of the UK, and being such, I would guess that gives you access to some of these so-called evil access countries that, as Americans, we might not have. Number one, the diplomatic accessibility, and number two, the receptivity by the population. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, my view is get as many passports as you can, and I've actually got two. I've got a British and an Australian passport, and really, realistically, I have to say I'm Australian because I've been living in Australia for a long time. Both of my kids are born in Australia. It's where my business grew up in Australia. So Australia is. But nevertheless, if I'm in the UK, it's very useful being British because then you can stay there for forever. You can work anywhere in Europe. You can. And I do play off the two passports. So very often I'll have both passports in different embassies at the same time getting visas. So yeah, there's a lot to be said for different, and you're very unfortunate being told you're not allowed to go to this country and that country, and equally countries saying they won't accept you. I mean, that's another problem. But I've got an Israeli stamp in my Australian passport at the moment, so there's a number of countries I couldn't go to as an Australian right now, but I can go there as a Brit. So it's very strange. I'll just tell a quick visa story. In Darklands, there's 8 countries, which if I can... Congo, Zimbabwe, Haiti, Colombia, Papua New Guinea, 8 of them anyway. And I really thought about putting Somalia in, or Somaliland in. And Somalia, as some of you may know, is actually 3 countries. There's Somalia, where all the real trouble is, and Mogadishu. Then there's an area called Puntland, which is sort of separate from Somalia, and is not perfect, but not as bad as Somalia. And then up at the north, there's an area called Somaliland, which is really quite okay. They've got a democratically elected government. They've got their own currency. It's quite peaceful up there. It's not perfect because it's quite close to Somalia, but it's okay. But nobody will recognize it. Every other African country says don't recognize them because that might give some people in our country the idea of breaking away. So poor Somaliland, even though they are effectively independent, are not. They're not in the United Nations. They've only got 3 embassies. They've got one in Washington, D.C., which nobody recognizes. They've got one in Addis Ababa, and they've got one in London. And I thought, well, I might put Somaliland in this book. So I went to the Somaliland embassy to get a visa. And I filled the form in, and they said, well, put it in your passport right now. And I thought, this is terrific. None of this come back in a week's time while we assess whether we'll let you in or not. I said, OK. And the guy there, and this is a little office in the East End. It's not in Knightsbridge or Mayfair and any of the good parts of London. And he said that it's valid for 3 months. And I said, oh dear, I don't know if I'm going to be there in 3 months. And he said, well, tick the multiple entry box. He said, it's another £10, but then you can stay, then you've got 6 months to get there. Well, I said, okay, so I ticked that. And he said, tell you what, I'll make it a year. Don't we need more countries like this, with flexible embassies?
I like that.
Next question over here.
So having traveled with Lonely Planet in the early 80s throughout all of Southeast Asia, one of the great experiences was, of course, everybody else traveling that route was also with Lonely Planet, and you got all your information from other travelers because you were completely isolated from the rest of the world. And I'm wondering how that's changed for 20-year-olds who are traveling now who are always connected.
Yeah, it is a shame in a way, that we do have too much communication sometimes, and sometimes it's rather nice just to be cut off and not be in touch with the world and know that your mother isn't going to call up and ask where you are, or your wife's going to ask when you're coming back. And it's great sometimes when you can do these amazing things and get through from the ridiculous locations. But there was something about those days when you were in a different world. And so many, I always remember post restantes where you got people to write to you and the mail would be held at post offices.
Or the American Express.
Or American Express did the same thing, yes. And you'd get there and very often the letters were misfiled. They'd be under T for Tony rather than W for Wheeler, and you wouldn't find them. Or they'd been sat there for 3 months and they'd been sent back home just before you got there.
Or you'd get money.
Or you get money, all sorts of wonderful things. They were great, and that sort of thrill of it has gone out. On the other hand, the internet cafes had their own particular. There's different things that make life interesting today that weren't then. But yeah, it's a shame we haven't got that sort of camaraderie of travellers. Although you get far enough off the beaten track, and I even say this in Australia. That in Australia, we drive around the cities, and we just like driving around San Francisco. But there's a certain distance you get out from the cities in Australia into the outback, and you never see a car coming the other way that you don't just raise 2 fingers off the steering wheel. And it's just, hi, I see you, I'm going the opposite way to you. And it's just like there's this sort of barrier that when you get far enough out, you know that you start waving at other drivers to say hello, hi, there you are. But then you get still further out, and when you see a car coming the other way, you both stop. And you both get out of the car, and you say to them, how was the road you've come? I said, no, the road's not bad for the next 200 miles. Seen any cars? No, you're the first car I've seen for 2 days. And that's nice. It is nice that you can still go places in the world where you haven't seen a car for 2 days.
Next question.
Next question over here.
Yes. So if you were going to be a 25-year-old Chinese person or a 25-year-old Indian person and start a family, what, from your experiences, are the considerations?
Of traveling?
No, of being an Indian or a Chinese today as a 25-year-old starting your family and career.
Oh, God, I don't know. In China, they're getting into a lot of things, and, travel is definitely one of them. It's amazed me how the Lonely Planet is a real name in China. And it's not across the masses, but there's enough of a middle class that there are these young people who just want to go traveling. And I go to China. I was in China. Lonely Planet was relaunching the guides with a new Chinese partner. The first partner fell apart, as things happen do in China. But I feel like a bit of a rock star in China because the young Chinese, it's so keen to do it, and they want to get me to autograph their books and all this sort of thing. It's amazing. But I remember when we first launched Lonely Planet Guides in China, our Chinese partners, the books were on sale the first day, and they were doing little, leaving Q&As with people leaving the bookshops having bought a Lonely Planet guide. And this one young Chinese guy came out of the bookshop with the Chinese translation of the Lonely Planet Guide to Western Europe. And they said to him, we see you bought the Western Europe guide. Can you tell us, are you planning to go to Western Europe? And where are you going to go to? And he said, oh, no. He said, I'm not going to West. He said, I couldn't afford that at all. It's a dream of the future. He said, but I said, I live and I'm in the city center, and I see foreign tourists coming all the time. And I see them all clutching their Lonely Planet China guide. And he said, now I've got the Western Europe guide. He said, and I feel like I'm one of them. And I thought, that's wonderful. I just loved that, that he couldn't do it, but he could take that first step towards doing it. He could dream about it, and he already had the guidebook in his language. I just thought that was terrific. I was so, and the other thing, I wrote a column for a Chinese magazine for a while. Actually, I write a column for an Indian travel magazine at the moment. But for several years, I wrote this column for this Chinese magazine. And I tried to sort of do either it was general travel, and I put a little bit of Chinese flavor into it, or something specifically Chinese. And I was in England, and I went up to Cambridge University once, in search of a Chinese poet. Because there's a particular Chinese poet who every young Chinese will have studied his poetry at school and can quote his poems. And he had a bit of a rock star life that he went off. He studied at Cambridge University when he was 21, back in the 1930s. Came back to China, had a couple of years writing poems that every Chinese kid can now quote, and then left his wife and took off with a girlfriend, so he did that sort of rock star thing. And then at the age of about 30, in the 1930s, was killed in a plane crash. Mm. So, he was ahead of his time, he was a bit of a Buddy Holly or James Dean, that sort of thing. One of his poems is about leaving Cambridge University and no longer being able to sit out and look at the dreaming spires and sit under the willow tree. And as a result, all young Chinese who go to England want to go there and sit under this willow tree. And I went there, and I knew the willow tree, and sure enough, there are Chinese. And nobody at Cambridge knows about it at all. Nobody thinks, why are the Chinese all sitting under this tree? I really liked that. I really liked that there was a little bit of Cambridge that the Chinese have made part of China. I wrote this article, I said, this is the most famous tree in all of England. Well, it is. It's a tree that every person in China knows about.
That's fantastic.
Next question over here.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Wheeler. I've managed to explore 60 countries using my wits and some of your books and, good fortune. But the top of my bucket list is Antarctica. Now, I've written the Lindblads. My mom was Swedish. I live on a pensioner's budget. Any ideas or any suggestions you might have? Or have you been there? Or could you discuss a little bit?
Yeah, I have.
Antarctica.
Unfortunately, Antarctica is one of those places that you sort of feel it's the ultimate bucket list. You know, once you've ticked it, you've been there and don't need to do that again. And the truth is that everybody who goes to Antarctica wants to go back again. And one trip to Antarctica is not enough. You know, they do, most of us, if we go to Antarctica the first time, when we do the standard thing is you go down to Ushuaia at the bottom of Argentina, you go across to the Antarctic Peninsula. It's the shortest trip, so you're seasick for the shortest period of time, because you will get seasick unless you're exceptional. And, you know, there's the most to see. There's the most penguin colonies, the most abandoned stations. There's the most of everything. So you do that, but then having done that, then you think, oh dear, I want to see South Georgia, which is the most amazing island, which I've done. I want to go down and see where, you know, the early explorers went on the other side, which is a much bigger trip. So it's a repeat trip thing, and it's not cheap. It's cheap. It's much cheaper now, thanks to the Russians. It's all Russian, ex-Russian polar ships, either polar ships or ships that, you know, were spy ships, which are the things you use to go down there. If you want to go down there cheaply, one way is to go down, hang around in Ushuaia, and eventually you'll meet someone with a yacht who's going to sail down there and could do with a member of crew. And if you don't get seasick and you know a bit about yachts, you might be able to blag your way on board a yacht. But you've got to hang around in Ushuaia for a long time waiting for it.
There's an idea. One last question? Here's one right here in the front, Brian.
I'm just wondering what's left on your bucket list. Is there anywhere you haven't been yet?
I've got so many things on my bucket list, and unfortunately, it keeps getting longer. The country that I keep saying I really must go to is the Yemen, which has always fascinated me. It's got this amazing mud architecture, these mud skyscrapers. Unfortunately, of course, it's a country that's always been bad to go to, and periodically it gets worse, and right now it's worse to go to. And you might get hit by a drone as well, so you've got to be careful in that respect. The Americans will get you while you're down there. So the Yemen, although it's on my list, is not going to be ticked off in the next 12 months, I don't think, but there's lots of other things that I really must get around to, and some of them I will.
Well, and some of the countries that Tony Wheeler mentions in Darklands that we didn't get to talk about today are the Democratic Republic of Congo, fascinating place, Colombia,
Nauru. Now, Nauru's a weird place.
I didn't even know, I'm sorry to say, was a country. So
it is in the UN, unlike Somaliland.
There's a lot more. Tony Wheeler, this has been wonderful. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Thanks most to Tony Wheeler. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.